Hi, everyone. I'm Doug Alsdorf, the author of Financing Your Future. And here in Chapter 5, we're going to talk about loans. And we're going to talk in particular, we're going to answer two questions. Should I pay off my loans? Should I buy or rent? There's three major expenses in life. We've already talked about taxes, and in chapter 4, and chapter 5, we'll talk about loans now. And then finally, in chapter 6, we'll deal with budgeting and the costs of raising children. So let's do this outline that you see through here. This is actually going to be kind of a long presentation. We're going to spend some time first talking about the basics of amortized loans. Then we're going to answer the question of paying off a loan early, yes or no, should you do that? And then answer the question of should you buy or continue to rent. So let's start with looking at amortized loans. These are loan basics. So how does a bank actually make money when they loan you money? How do they make money? Well, they make it in two important ways: interest on the loan and fees. The fees are actually usually small, at least in comparison to the interest. The interest is really where they're making their money. So there's some basics of loans, and this is going to kind of sound almost like loan babble until you see the examples. So there's three basics of loans that we need to keep track of. You can have either a low monthly payment, but then you're going to pay a lot of interest over the lifetime of the loan, or you can have a high monthly payment and a low total interest that you're going to pay. The total interest paid, that's the biggest cost for the loan. It can be really enormous. We're going to see a lot of examples of that. The longer that loan period, is it a 4 or 5 year loan period, say for a car, or a 30-year loan period, say for a house? The greater that length, the total amount of interest you're going to pay. You're almost certainly going to have an amortized loan. I don't know of anyone who's had anything but an amortized loan, at least in terms of loans given to us from the bank or the federal government for student loans. So this means that you're going to pay a lot of interest at the beginning of the loan period. We'll see that as well. So let's imagine that you would like to buy a car, and the total cost of the car is $30,000, and that includes all the taxes, fees, and so on. And you can Google right now in the summer of 24 and find that the interest rate on used cars is about 7% for that loan. And the loan periods are about 4, 5, and 6 years in order for you to pay back the loan. You're going to probably need about 20% down, so that's about $6,000 on that $30,000 cost, and hence the loan amount to you is $24,000. You can pause to read this minor detail. So here are three different loans. You go into the loan spreadsheet, and then you can enter these green parameters that you see here. And the only difference between these three loans is the length of the loan. The loan period goes from 4 years to 5 years to 6 years to pay it back. So let's now have a look at the monthly payment versus the total interest. Here's a short amount of loan period, a short amount of payback time, and you're paying out about $575 per month with a total interest of about, say, 3,600. If we now switch to one extra year, 5 years, now we see the monthly payment has dropped by $100, but the total interest paid is now $4,500. And then when we switch this car all the way to a 6 year loan payment, now the monthly payment is far less than the monthly payment for the 4 year version, but the total interest paid is now $2,000 greater. And so the total cost of the car for this first loan is 33,500. For the next loan, for 5 year loan period, it's 34,500, and for 6 years, it's a $35,500 car. So in other words, it's not a $30,000 car, it's a $35,500 car. You really want to think about these sort of costs when you go to buy anything with a loan. I invite you to pause the slide to read this blue text. It's also in the book as well, explaining why longer loan periods may actually have a higher interest rate on the loan compared to shorter periods. So that was a look at car loans. And car loans are kind of typical. People kind of get car loans from time to time. Student loans are another kind of typical loan, and then we'll end talking about mortgages on houses, the three typical loans. So I do a little bit of Google work, and Investopedia says that the average student loan debt is about $37,000. That may or may not be your kit situation, but it's a starting point for us to have a conversation. Now, loans require a collateral. Your car is collateral. When you buy the car and you take out a loan, the car is collateral. If you don't pay the loan back, the bank comes and takes the car. Same thing with a house. But a student loan, is it secured? Is there collateral? No. Some students, so keep that in mind. Some student loans are subsidized by the federal government. What is the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized? Well, the federal government pays interest on the loan while you're in college. So you take out the loan, but you're in college for 3, 4, 5 years. You're not paying the loan back right away. When you take out a loan on a car, you start making payments the next month. But when you take out a student loan, you're taking it out so you can go get a degree, graduate, and then start paying it back. Well, during those years that you're in college, the loaned amount is accruing interest, and the federal government pays that interest when it's a subsidized loan. Well, you can get from a bank, you can get an unsubsidized loan from a bank, and then what they actually do is they take all that interest that you would have paid and they stick that into the loan amount, and you got to pay that as well in the loan. Gets a little complicated, but you want them to explain all that to you when you take out these loans. So, student loans, this is just kind of a generalization based on my Googling. It turns out students aren't really willing to share their loan information with me, but it's helpful at least to see these basics, and you can relate to this if you have one. Most student loans require payments starting about 6 months after graduation, and no payments, like I say, while you're in school. But that interest is accruing. So the summed interest is added into the loan, as I've already said, and depending upon how it's calculated, it can be thousands of dollars for that interest while you're in college. So that is a big additional cost. In other words, you're not just paying for your tuition, room, and board, you're paying for this accrued interest as well. So in 2024, the federal rate for subsidized loans was about 5.5%. Private loans could be more interest rate or lower interest rate depending on a number of factors such as credit history, who else is co-signing the loan with you, and so on. Loan periods are from 10 to 30 years. There is a maximum amount that the federal government will loan. I don't know about private banks. There may or may not be a maximum on that. Watch out for fees. Probably going to be several $100s in fees. Okay, so now let's take the student loan idea and get an idea of why the total interest paid is really costly. It's kind of difficult, given all those parameters I just talked about on this previous slide, it's kind of difficult to generalize student loan into a typical example. So you're going to need to open up the spreadsheet and enter your parameters to understand your particular loans that you might be considering. So for an example, let's just say it's a $40,000 loan, and we're going to look at 3 different scenarios. We're going to look at a 4% interest rate. Now, you're not going to get a 4% interest rate these days, but maybe you did several years ago. And a 10-year loan period. Look at a 5% interest rate on the loan, 15-year, 7% interest, and a 20-year loan. So $40,000 loan, 4% interest, 10-year loan period is $405 per month, and the total interest paid is $8,600. So that's a $49,000 cost of education. At 5% and 15-year period, the total interest is nearly $17,000, and hence it's a $57,000 education, not a $40,000. And finally, at 7% in 20 years, all of a sudden we're close to $35,000, and hence a $74,000 cost of education when we add this 34 and that 40 together. That's a lot of money. Are you sure this is the right thing? When I talk about this with my students at Ohio State, I always suggest to them that maybe they should consider community college for their first 3 semesters. Community college is always less expensive than the big time colleges. So imagine taking out of your 4-year experience, taking a year and a half at a far, far lower cost to you. I think that's really worth looking into. And of course, many people, they respond saying, well, no, I want to go to the big school. It has all these sorts of wonderful things that I want to experience. But they don't factor in these enormous costs. They're pushing these costs until after graduation and not realizing them during school. And so it's hard to really understand that these are big, big costs. I honestly think community college is a great value, and you should highly consider that as you think about how to pay for college. Now let's look at a home mortgage. So this would be a loan for a lot of money. We're going to pay off a house. Houses are quite expensive. And this is going to be an example that the interest paid is at the beginning of the loan. So we're going to use a home loan, set it up for 30 years. We're going to see that it is the interest being paid is not constant amount year after year after year. It's actually got a curved shape to the plot, and I'll show that to you so you see what I mean. So we're going to have a look at it, say a $300,000 mortgage with, or $300,000 condo or house. We're going to put 20% down and take out a $240,000 loan with 7% interest, and it's a 30-year loan period. This means the monthly payment is about $1,600 or about $19,000 annually. But look at that total interest paid, $335,000 in interest. Compared to the house or the condo itself, the interest paid is more than the actual value of the house. That's a lot of cost. So if we set this all up in the tax table, or I'm sorry, in the loan tables in the spreadsheet, you're going to see this on the tab. So you enter 300,000, 20%, 7% for the interest rate and 30 years. There's your loan amount. There's the monthly payment. There's that total interest paid. Here's the total amount paid. Here's the total cost because we're going to add in that 60,000. So we're going to take 240 plus 60 plus that interest, and we're going to get this number right here. In other words, it's not a $300,000 house. It's a $635,000 house. Really expensive. As we go into the payments, here's your first month, second month, so on. Here's a full year of payments. What we see in the payments is that there's the total amount that you're paying is $1,600. So this would be the way an amortized loan works. So we have 1596, 1597 as our monthly payment. In that very first payment, second payment, third payment, and so on, we see about $1,400 of the 1597 is going toward the interest. Only 197 is going toward the principal. After a full year of payments, you've paid off about $2,400 on the principal, $240,000 loan. So you've only paid off 1% of the actual loan, but look at all that interest you've given to the bank. The bank is getting paid upfront early. Let's make a plot of these two columns so that you can begin to see just how this summation works. Let me move this. You can't see it, but there's a window here from the Zoom recording in the way, and I'll move me down here. So here are the length of the loan, and it's the years remaining on the loan. So you start over here, and you're working your way toward the end of the loan, maybe when you have 10 years left, 5 years left, and so on. Well, here's the halfway point of the loan. And at the halfway point, you're like, oh, I should have paid off half the interest and half of the loan amount. No, you've paid off $225,000 on the interest. The interest total was $334,000. So you've paid off way more than half of the interest. In other words, this line is not a straight line, it's a curved line. And the curve is shaped like this, indicating to us that we're paying off a lot of the interest at the beginning of the loan, but paying off very little of the actual loaned amount. And that's really challenging for us. Banks get paid up front. That's what this is showing us. And all amortized loans function like this. And so here we see you've only paid off $63,000 of the actual $240,000 loaned amount. This is deeply challenging for us and demonstrates to us how costly loans are, and that the cost is at the beginning of the loan, not at the end of the loan. That cost being the total interest paid. Okay, so loans are not linear. And so, in other words, when we compare two loans, there's not a linear comparison. So let's compare this $30,000 car loan we've already talked about to a $300,000 loan. So the car loan was for 4 years, and the home loan is for 30 years. And that's about a 7.5, you could call it even 10x just for round numbers comparison, 4 years compared to 30. 30 is that much greater than 4, 7.5 times greater. Now, the 20% down is exactly 10% greater on the $60,000 home versus the $6,000 down payment. Sorry. The interest rates are the same, so no change there. The monthly payment is about a 3x. The home has about $1,600 compared to about $600 or so, and that's almost a 3x comparison. However, this is the big deal. So far, this is not quite linear, but close enough, but this is the problem. Soon as we extend the loan period to 30 years, now the total interest paid is nearly 100 times greater. Not 7.5, not 10, not 3, nearly 100 times greater. And that's what I mean by loans are not linear. You can't take a car loan and just multiply it out by the number of years left in order to calculate the interest. It's not how it works. You need to use these spreadsheets to figure out these numbers. So there's also an opportunity cost involved in a loan we haven't actually talked about yet. So let's go back to this car loan, this $30,000 car loan with $6,000 down payment. It has a 7% interest rate on the loan, and that means it's $409 per month in payments or $4,900 per year. So we can use in Formula 3, an investing formula spreadsheet, to calculate the opportunity cost. So we enter in the $6,000 lump sum. We're gonna grow that. This is the investment growth rate. So you're gonna invest this money, and we're gonna say that it's gonna grow at 5%. That's kind of conservative. We're not over a very short period of time of only 6 years. We're not expecting the stock market to perform at 10, 11, 12% or whatever you think it might be. Indeed, there are time periods when the stock market actually goes down. But here we're just going to during those short time periods. But here we're going to say, well, let's say the stock market has a 5% growth on it. That's kind of conservative, but it helps us to understand what the opportunity costs are. So we're going to grow the 6,000 per year at 5%, but we're also going to invest $4,900 per year. We're going to do this as an annual accounting versus a monthly accounting. We're going to invest $4,900 per year for 6 years, plus that 6,000 also growing. That all adds up to $41,000. It wasn't a $30,000 car. It wasn't a $35,461 car. That's the interest costs. It's a $41,000 car. It's an extra $11,000 because you weren't investing the monies. Of course, you need a car to drive. So it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. You got to drive. You got to get somewhere. You got to go to your job. You need this car. So the opportunity cost here is just something for you to understand what you're doing, but certainly you're going to pay that interest amount. That's a very real cost. All right, so that was our basics of amortized loans. Now we're going to get into paying off a loan early. Okay, so with those basics of amortized loans, let's have a look at should you pay off a loan early. This gets a little complicated, and in fact, even I get, kind of confused as I work my way through this. So we're going to just take our time and carefully work our way through these ideas. So the question is, should you pay off a loan early? So here's the scenario, and this is in the book, and you can carefully read the book as well as rewatching the video. Let's say you have $40,000 in student loans and you've been working for 3 years, and during your 3 years of work, you've accumulated $25,000 in your investments. And let's say you are a really cool person and you have a really wonderful aunt who loves you, and she has given to you $15,000. That's wonderful. So you got $15,000 from her and $25,000 in your investments. You could pay off the loan should you so choose. So should you do that or not? Well, the answer depends on a few key things, one of which is your behavior with money. We're going to come to this down here at this bottom point. So let's start with this. Is your $25,000 in a taxable account? Then you can easily withdraw it. But if it's in a tax deferred account, you don't have such easy access to that $25,000. You would have to pay a 10% penalty. So if you wanted $25,000, you'd really need to withdraw about $28,000. 10% penalty on that would be 2,800, call it 3,000. So 3,000 from 28,000 is the 25,000 you want. So it actually is costing you an extra, $3,000, an extra 2,800 bucks. So this is kind of tricky. I'm going to suggest that hopefully the money is in a taxable account as opposed to a tax deferred account. It's going to depend on the loan parameters, and we're going to see that very clearly in the upcoming examples, as well as the future investment growth rate. So we have interest rates in the loan versus investment growth rate. But here's a real big important factor. Let's say you have this loan on the one hand, and you have the lump sum $40,000 on the other hand. Okay, if you pay off the loan with that $40,000, you have already planned on making all those future monthly payments. You were going to make those payments. So in order to do an apples to apples comparison, we have to say that your future behavior would be you would still not pay off the loan with those payments because you paid it off the lump sum, but you would invest those future monthly payments. So that's the key. You can't just like, well, I paid off the loan and then spend the future monthly payments willy-nilly. No, you have to invest those future payments in order to make this comparison work correctly. So that's what I'm saying down here. What would you do with those monthly payments? Well, if you pay off the loan, then you're going to invest those. That's how this works. So we have some options, and I invite you to have a look at the loan invest spreadsheet. Our options are pay off the loan or keep the loan. Pay it off with the 40,000 and invest all the future payments. That's column O in the spreadsheet. Keep the loan, pay it from your income, but invest the 40,000. So keep in mind that you're actually in year 3 and you've already paid off some of the loan, so you don't even need the full 40,000. How much you need is going to depend on the loan interest parameters as well as the loan period. So we'll have a look at that. So you don't need all that. So let's look at two different scenarios here on these two options. So two different scenarios. In scenario A, we're going to have a low interest rate on the loan, but a high investment rate. So the investment rate is greater than the loan interest, and it's a 15-year loan period. Let's mix it up a little bit and say it's a 7% interest rate on the loan, which is kind of what we're experiencing today with loans. But we're going to say, well, future investment rates are smaller. The growth rates are smaller than the loan, and it's a long loan period. So we're going to look at those two scenarios in the upcoming examples. Okay, I had to pause there just to take a breather. It's this is where things get busy. So this is a screen grab of the loan invest tab in the loan spreadsheet, and you can go in there and enter all these parameters. So here's scenario A. We got 4% interest rate. That's right there where you enter that. It's a 15-year loan period. You enter that in that position on the loan. Remember, it's a $40,000 loan. Over here is how many years remain on the loan. Where are we at? Well, we're in the third year of the loan. Therefore, 12 more years remain on this 15-year loan. Okay, now, one more thing. The investment growth rate, that's these 7% values right in here. And you should always enter them as the same value just to make a complete comparison, a fair comparison amongst each column. So after 36 payments, after 3 years, you owe on the principal about $34,000, close to that. Whereas on the total loan amount, principal plus interest, you're going to still need to owe almost 43,000, 42,600 is still how much you would pay out. In other words, if you kept paying this loan year after year after year for 12 more years, you would pay out 42,600. If you just paid off the loan in this third year, you would pay out 33,700 because you only have to pay the principal. Okay, so option one, we're going to invest the payments. We're going to pay off the loan. We're going to pay it off. So we're going to plunk down 33,794. You don't need that full 40. But there's 144 future payments that are about $296. In other words, 144 future payments. 12 times 12 is how many more payments are. We're going to invest all those payments year after year. We're going to invest all those payments. And we're going to come up with, let's see here, I'm going to lose track as I even go through this, right? So that's why it's all written out nicely. We're going to results in 63,513. So we're going to invest all the future payments. That's this column right there. Invest all those future payments. But we have to subtract off that amount we already paid to pay off the loan. So that subtracting 33.7 from 63.5 gives us almost $30,000. That's how much you would have at the end of those 12 years. Not at the beginning where we're just now starting, but at the end of 12 years. That's what this means in terms of the accounting. So that's option one. Invest the payments, pay off the loan. Let's say instead we're going to invest the lump sum and keep the loan. So we're going to invest the 33,000. We're going to invest that amount. We're going to keep paying those future payments to the loan. We're going to pay that out of our income, but invest that lump sum. Assume a 7% growth rate. That yields 76,000. So we're going to invest that lump sum, and after 12 years, it would grow to 76,000. We're going to invest this amount over here, and it would grow to 76,000 after 12 years. Now, what we have to do, because we kept the loan, 12 years later, we have to subtract off how much we have paid on the loan, and that comes out then to 33,000. After 12 years, if we kept the loan, we would have 33,500 compared to 29,700 paying off the loan. So the option here in this sort of scenario, 4% interest rate with a high investment growth rate, the idea here is that you should choose option two, which is to invest that lump sum. And that kind of makes sense because the low interest rate on the loans means that future payments are small and thus wouldn't grow to as much as that lump sum amount would grow to. Now, in the spreadsheet, there are plots like this one. In particular, this one down here is very helpful for us to see this. What we have here is years remaining on the loan. So we're just talking about this positioning right in through here, which is where we have 12 years left on the loan. So we were right around in this place right here. And we see that the advantage of keeping the loan was a few $1,000s more. It was about $4,000 more. And that's about the difference between the blue point and the green point where I'm moving the pointer. Notice as we get closer and closer to the end of the loan, it doesn't make much difference. And that's because the bank is getting their interest up front on the loan. All right, so that was scenario A. Whew, yeah, that was a lot. Let's now have a look at scenario B. Again, we have the 7% interest rate on the loan is here, and we have a 20-year loan period now, and the investment growth rate is smaller. It's at 5%. Investment growth rate is smaller than the interest rate on the loan. Okay, now after 36 payments, because the loan parameters have changed from the previous example, we now owe in the principal about $37,000, and the total amount owed on the loan still with 17 more years to go, that's $63,000 that we still owe. So let's go through option one. We're going to invest the payments, pay off the loan, but invest all those future loan payments. So we're going to pay off the loan with this amount right here, because that's how much we just have to give to the bank, and then they'd be like, okay, thanks, you're done with the loan. So you don't need the full 40,000. We're going to invest 204 future payments. The payment amounts in this case are $310, but because we have 17 more years to go, we've got 204 future monthly payments of $310 per month. Well, investing that grows to $96,000 for 17 after 17 years. But we have to subtract off the amount we paid on the principal, because that was what we did here. We're investing the payments and paying off the loan. We have to subtract that off to make the comparison, and we see that we're going to have, after 17 years, about $59,000. Option two, now we're going to keep the loan, but invest that lump sum amount. We're going to invest, and then paying those, we're going to pay the future payments, the $310 payments. We're just going to keep paying that. So we're going to invest this $36,000. We're going to assume a 5% growth rate like we've already entered here, and that yields $84,000 after 17 years. But we have to subtract off, remember, because we kept the loan, we have to subtract off the amount we paid on the loan. Subtracting 63,000 from 84,000 makes 21,000. Clearly, if we want to make more money, we're going to choose option one. We're going to pay off the loan. And that makes sense, because that large interest rate on the loan and the lower investment growth rate means that the future loan payments are big. And even though it's a small investment growth rate, they still grow to a large amount because there are large payments being made. So you can look over here then at the plot, and we see that we were just in the 17th year, which is right around in here. Look at the big gap between these. This is the bigger this gap is, the clearer the choice for the topmost line. In this case, the topmost line is pay off the loan. So in this case, where the interest rate is large, and even though the investment growth rate is smaller, we're still going to want to pay off that loan. So that kind of, begs the question, should you pay off a loan early? Well, there's always a catch. And the catch here is, how well do you know yourself? If you're going to pay it off, then you have to invest all those future monthly loan payments, month after month. You have to invest those. Would you even do it annually? So make certain you do that. And then of course, there's also another catch. How well do you actually know those future investment growth rates? You definitely know the future loan payment amounts. That's a fixed amount. So there's some generalizations that we can make from the loan invest spreadsheet. So the generalization is this: if you expect future investment growth rates will be larger than the loan interest rate, keep the loan. Don't pay it off. But how much greater does that future investment growth rate need to be compared to the loan interest? So now what we're going to do, I'm just going to move myself out of the way. We're going to talk about a $40,000 loan with a 5% loan interest. So that's kind of not really what's happening in today's loan interest world in here in 2024, 2025. But we might see interest rates go down in the next few years, maybe. So in any event, let's assume this. You can enter in your own parameters for your loan, but here's a $40,000 loan, 5% investment growth rate for 20 years. And what we're going to do in each one of these boxes is compare that. Let me just keep me moved out of the way. That 5% investment growth rate or 5% loan. See, even I'm getting confused. Take that 5% loan interest and compare it to a 3% investment growth rate, a 5% investment growth rate, a 7 or a 9. And when the blue line is greater than the green line, pay off the loan. So here we see the blue line at 3% is greater. At 5%, the blue line is greater than the green line. It's not until 7% investment growth rate compared to that 5% interest rate. Then there's kind of a break-even proposition. We really need that investment growth rate to be about 2 percentage points greater than the interest rate on the loan. So, yeah, the choice, the investment growth rate is less than, equal, or even slightly greater than the interest rate. It's best to pay off the loan and invest the future payments. The choice becomes less meaningful the closer we are to maturity. Look here in each one of these plots, as we get down to about 5 years left, the difference between the blue and the green line here, it's nothing. Of course, it wasn't much to begin with. But even here, where the difference is large, as we get toward the end of the loan, the difference between the blue and the green line is so small, it doesn't really make much difference in what you choose to do. All right, so I hope that was helpful. I'm going to stop this recording here, and then we'll get into buying versus renting. Okay, let's ask this final question when we investigate loans, which is it better to buy or is it better to continue renting? Here I'm assuming that you have a rental unit somewhere and you've been talking to your friends and they're like, "Hey, I bought a house," and you're looking at your rent, and your rent might be $2,800, whereas they might have a mortgage for say $2,300 monthly payment, and you immediately think, "Wow, I'm losing 500 bucks a month compared to them." But are you really? Well, let's look at the costs and gains from owning a house versus costs and gains from renting. And then we're going to break these down into the spreadsheet itself. So the gains from owning a house, well, hopefully the house gains in value, but to realize those gains, you got to sell it and move out. Nevertheless, we can keep an accounting of that. The home location could be really ideal for raising your family, and that would be just wonderful. Have great schools and beautiful neighbors. That was certainly my experience with our house where we raised our sons. So that was really fabulous. And here's one that I can't really put this in a spreadsheet, but this is a powerful emotion. Owning a house feels really good. But there are costs. There's that monthly mortgage payment. We're going to see that in the spreadsheet. There's a one-time down payment. We've already seen those one-time down payments when we looked at car loans, and they're going to see them now in the house loan. There's a thing called a realtor fee. Realtors are involved in the buying and selling of houses, and they need a cut of the action, and we'll see that in the spreadsheet. There's homeowners insurance that banks require you to have homeowners insurance. That can cost a couple $1,000s a year. And of course, property taxes, we've already had a quick look at those in chapter 4, and I encourage you to go into Zillow or Realtor.com, look at various houses in the neighborhoods where you are interested and see what their property taxes are like. And you're going to find that that can be easily $1,000 a month. So yeah, that can be deeply challenging. But then there's these additional costs, home maintenance things. You might have to repair something on the roof, or maybe the HVAC unit, the air conditioner, and so on might need to be replaced and fixed. Of course, there's everyday things like lawn care, and maybe you have to irrigate the lawn, maybe painting. There's just a whole bunch of things that add up that we need to keep an accounting for because the renter doesn't pay those. So what are the gains from renting? Well, the renter, they have that one-time down payment. They didn't, if there's $100,000 down payment, which we'll see in the next slides, they still have that $100,000 in their rental pocket, whereas the homeowner gave that $100,000 to the bank. So that's a gain from renting. But here's another thing. The renter, if all of their costs, not just their rent, and here we see that's their monthly cost plus their renter's insurance, if all of those monthly costs are less than all of these monthly costs, then they have a little bit extra that they can be investing compared to the homeowner. So we need to keep track of that. I think one of the problems with renting is there's definitely negative feelings about renting. Hey, you may not like your landlord, or there might be some kind of weird smells from across the hallway, right? And so it becomes very emotionally negative sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you rent. So I can't factor these emotions into a spreadsheet. You'll have to keep track of that for yourself. Okay, so let's have a look at this home mortgage. And so we're just going to assume in this example, and again, you can adjust the parameters in the spreadsheet. That's the beauty of having the spreadsheets, is you can adjust them all to match your particular life. So let's assume you're going to buy a $500,000 house, and the down payment on that is 20%. That's pretty typical for houses. Let's hope it's sometime in the future where interest rates have come down from their 7% values today, which is 2024, 2025. Maybe they'll be at 5% when you buy a house, but you'll probably go with a 30-year fixed mortgage. You see your monthly payment is about 2150. Total interest paid $373,000. That's real comparable to the actual loan amount. The total cost of this house, it's not a $500,000 house, it's an $873,000 house. Just keep that in mind as you begin to think about home ownership. Okay, so now let's start putting this all together. What are the gains from owning a house? So here's a monthly accounting, and here you say, well, let's just kind of start this 10 years into the future when hopefully interest rates are lower. We don't know, but it's useful for making a scenario. So here we are in the future, and we're going to do annual accounting in this table for the total amount of interest paid, total amount of principal paid, and then what's still owed on the loan. So over here, we're going to take the house. It's a $500,000 house. We're going to grow its value at, say, 4.5% a year. In the book, you're going to see a chart in there, a plot in there, that seems to be the average growth rate of houses across the U.S. For all kinds of different timelines. It's about 4.5%. That comes to us from Robert Shiller, the Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale. So in any event, have a look at the book for that plot. So that's how fast the $500,000 is going to grow. And we see after 10 years, it grows to $776,000. But that's not how much money you have. You don't actually have that amount of money. You definitely haven't made that because the bank still owns a good chunk of this house. We have to subtract off from this amount the amount that the bank, how much you still owe the bank. So when you do that subtraction, that's the equity in the house. That's this column right there. So 776 minus 325, that's 451,000. That's how much you actually have in the house in your investment. These two columns you can ignore by and large. In the past, there was an opportunity to have a tax deduction based on the amount of interest that you've paid. That was a tax deduction and hence a savings to you and a benefit that you could have invested. Those have gone away as the tax law changes have changed and that the standard deduction now is much higher than it used to be. All right, so this column over here, the total value because of the house is the same as the equity in the house. So this is how much you actually have in your investment based on all of this payings. Wow. Okay, so what are the costs of owning a house? So here's how much you have in the house. That's this column right here. That's the equity in the house. That's right there. But if you sell the house, you're going to have to pay the realtors. In the past, that fee was 6% of the sale value, which was then split between the selling and buying agent. This number might be coming down based on some court cases that happened in 2024, and you can read the book to just get a touch on that. There's annual property taxes and other costs. And I've invited you in the past when we were talking about taxes to suggest that maybe about 1.75% is appropriate for property taxes, but it really depends upon where you live. California numbers will be less than this. Ohio and Texas might be more than that. So this is a round number that you can work with. But you also got to pay all those maintenance costs, things like a broken furnace or a hot water tank, or wow, if you have to replace a roof, then this number really goes up. So this is probably a little conservative at 2.5% of the total value of the house as just a way of estimating those costs. Might be a little conservative and therefore favoring the homeowner. The annual cost of buying the house. Now we have not only these annual property taxes, but let's go back. We have all that principal paid and all this interest paid year after year. So we're going to add those together, the interest paid, the principal paid, and this additional cost here that pays for taxes. And so I'm going to add those all up. for that year, and there's another value for that year and that year. But if we want to sum those all up year after year after year, this is the total amount of cost paid, say down here in the 11th year of this particular loan. You have all these annual costs plus this one-time realtor fee. Wow, that's a big number. So if you add up all of these and compare that to the equity you have in your house, you've paid out, because you've done all these annual payings, you've paid out $565,000, but you've only made $451,000. Actually, in the 11th year, you're still behind about $113,000, $114,000. You haven't made any money on this investment, but you got to live somewhere. So let's compare now to buying or renting. Let's compare this scenario of buying to renting. So now when we look at renting and what's available to us from there, we're going to start off with this annual amount over here. This is how much the homeowner is spending year after year. If we just back up here, we see that that's this column right there. That's the annual cost of buying the house. That includes the principal and interest on the loan. So this is how much the homeowner is spending year after year. Over here, this is how much the renter is spending year after year. And note that the rent is about $2,800. So that $2,800 is about $650 greater than the mortgage payment. But the homeowner is paying out all those additional costs, such as property taxes, which, like I say, can be $1,000 a month. There can be maintenance costs and so on that actually add up to making their numbers larger than the cost of rent. And I got this cost of rent by looking at $500,000 houses that would be renting out. Zillow gives us rental estimates, and this is a pretty fair assessment. This is about right for my experience, at least for houses in the Midwest that cost $500,000. They would rent for about $2,800. So now we see, okay, what does the renter have in their pocket? Well, they had that $100,000 down payment that the homeowner gave to the bank for the loan. So the renter has that they can invest. They're spending about $5,000 less per year than the homeowner. So they could invest that extra money. So we're going to take this $100,000 plus the 5,000, 5,000, 5,000, and we're going to grow that at 7% a year. That's how much the renter has. But we're going to subtract off all of their costs. And we see here well, this would be year 0 plus 5. So in the 6th year, the renter is starting to lose money. But we also saw, if we just go back here, we saw that the homeowner in that same year was also losing money. Who's losing more money? Well, it turns out the homeowner is losing about $82,000 and the renter is losing only about $31,000. So the renter is still ahead. They're both losing money, but the renter has lost less. And it turns out the renter's still ahead, even though they're negative in terms of where they're at in terms of their investments. It's not until the 8th or really 9th year, depending upon how you do the accounting, that the homeowner is ahead of the renter. Now we see the renter has lost about $130,000. But if we go back to here, we see that the homeowner looks like about $103,000. So yeah, this means that you have to own this house for, let's say, a decade before you are ahead of the renter. Yeah. So let's make some plots. Let's have a look at some plots. So we were just looking at the first few years of a loan. Now let's look at the entire 30-year timeline. And as always, when you see a plot, make certain you look at the axes. So this is the 30th year, the end of the loan, and this is how much money. So the red line is the cost of home ownership, and the blue line is how much that investment in the house has made. The cost is greater than what the house has made. And we subtract then the red from the blue, we get a negative number. This green line remains negative. In other words, the red line, the costs are greater than how much the investment is paid off until looks like about the 27 years or so. It takes nearly 30 years, almost the entire length of this particular loan setup that you've already seen the loan parameters for. It takes nearly 26, 27 years before this green line turns positive and the house is actually making money for you. The renter, as it turns out, is ahead until, like I say, the eighth or ninth year. But here, finally, this purple line turns positive, favoring the home ownership after, let's say, 8, 9 years. But the homeowner still hasn't made much money. Actually, they haven't made any money until much later in the life of that loan. 2, 3, almost 3 decades have to go by. So call it 26, 27 years. All right, now let's just change one parameter. We're going to change that loan interest rate from 5% to 7%. Wow. Now the cost of the house is always greater than how much that house has made. You're always behind. It's not a good investment, but you still got to live somewhere. And that's our challenge here. I can't put that cost of living somewhere, that feeling of like, well, I have to live somewhere. I can't put that feeling into a spreadsheet. You'll have to evaluate that for yourself. But here, what you're seeing for these loan setups, you're just not coming out ahead in this particular investment. Note that with this setup, with that just that one change of parameter, now instead of being the eighth or ninth year, it's around the 13th or 14th year when it's actually better to be owning a house instead of renting. In other words, those first few years, it's better to rent. All right, so some conclusions for this whole loan section. First off, loan interest is expensive. You're going to pay more than half of that interest by the halfway point of the loan period. If you've taken out a 10-year loan, by the fifth year of the loan, you've already paid way more than half of the interest. Given today's high interest rates, you're probably pay off your loan early is probably a good idea. Make certain you invest, though, what would have been those future loan payments. Owning a house is expensive. There's costs of the mortgage itself, but there's all kinds of costs that you may not be aware of, such as property taxes, that realtor fee. There's home maintenance that can really add up, and all of those add up to essentially the home ownership really doesn't start to pay off until decades after home ownership. All right, I hope this is helpful. I invite you to rewatch the videos as well as to reread the chapters.